Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate your time today. I just want to talk briefly about carbon taxes, which are purported to be a tool with which to achieve efficiency in the implementation of greenhouse gas policies. I think that argument as a general proposition is quite misguided for reasons I'm going to go through during the course of this talk. So what are the central rationales offered in favor of carbon taxes? There's the externality argument, which I'll describe in a moment. There's one version of the externality argument called the fat tail argument. There's a small chance of a catastrophe, so we really need to do something just as you would buy insurance against the small chance your house will burn down over the course of the next year. Then there's the argument that a carbon tax can be used to reduce the distortions created by the multiple taxation of capital and thereby achieve an efficiency improvement and bigger GDP with this revenue neutral tax shift. And the further argument that we would preserve fiscal neutrality by, as Senator Whitehouse puts it, returning the revenues to the American people. And I will have something to say about that in a moment. So let me start with the externality argument, which can be summarized really quite simply. Greenhouse gas emissions impose an adverse effect on third parties around the world that are not reflected in market prices. And so that's why the Obama administration, the Interagency Working Group, when it did its calculation of what's called the social cost of carbon, in other words, the part of greenhouse gas emissions not captured in market prices that emitters don't bear the cost of, they claim it's $32 a ton or $33 a ton in 2010, rising to various numbers depending on the discount rate you use, an issue I won't bore you with. The Obama administration's analysis of the social cost of carbon is deeply flawed for reasons I haven't got time to get into today, but suffice it to say it really and truly is an exercise in crass dishonesty, shameless even by Beltway standards. Then there's the further argument, well, gee, since people are not paying the social cost of their greenhouse gas emissions, if we impose an efficient tax, the social cost of carbon, then people will have the right incentives. They'll only emit the efficient level of greenhouse gas emissions, not the inefficiently large volume of emissions that we see now. And a tax is more efficient than command and control all the regulations we have, because once people face the tax, they can reduce their emissions in the cheapest possible way, which is very different from the government telling them how to do so in the form of what electricity to consume, et cetera. That's the basic argument for the carbon tax. And so that raises an immediate question, why is it that the same sort of political or public choice process that yields what the carbon tax people claim is an inefficient set of regulations, how would that same process produce what they claim is an efficient tax? We never really get an answer to that question. And that's a public choice issue that I think I have something to say about it in a while, but not much given the time constraints. So the question then becomes, is it really true that a tax, or is it believable that a tax is somehow more efficient than regulation simply because it enables the market to reduce emissions at the lowest possible cost? Well, the problem is what we call a fiscal illusion problem. A carbon tax would be hidden in the prices of millions of goods and services, or even given a public vote by Congress. How many people know how much of the price of a gallon of gasoline is taxes? I suspect not very many people know that. Well, fine, 2 out of 30 or so? I'm very proud of you for your omniscience, but nonetheless, I suspect that given, if you agree with me that a carbon tax would be hidden in the prices of lots of goods and services and not broken out on receipts, which would be impossible to do anyway, I think. And if you believe also that regulations and their attendant effects are kind of visible directly, think about the Clean Power Rule. If it's implemented after all the court challenges down the road, what you're going to find is electricity prices are going to be rising, not everywhere, but in most places, and certainly not equally. They'll be rising much more in states disproportionately dependent on coal power relative to other states. As it turns out, unsurprisingly, the states that lose are predominantly red states. Just as a footnote, and the states that win are predominantly blue states. The Beltway, the Obama administration and its EPA has produced a system to transfer wealth from its political enemies to its political allies. And I think that for reasons I'll discuss later on why that's really the underlying goal of the Clean Power Plan. It has nothing really to do with climate. So my view or my argument is in the context of political accountability, it's far, far from clear that a tax is more efficient if you believe that one underlying requirement for efficient outcomes is political accountability, the political constraints that we all believe should be imposed upon government. There's the further matter, the further problem of political time horizons. If you believe that political or policymakers generally and political office holders in particular have fairly short time horizons, then their incentives are to maximize revenues, not to optimize the emission of greenhouse gas emissions. Those are two very different goals, and so it's far from clear that the government has an incentive to adopt the efficient carbon tax. I claim I would argue they have incentives to adopt a carbon tax much higher than efficient. In fact, if you look at Senator Whitehouse's carbon fee, is what he calls it, tax proposal, it starts out at $45 a ton and rises at 2% a year, even after inflation. It's a revenue device. It's not really an environmental device. There's a further matter, and I'll get to this in a minute, that in order to really have an effect on global temperatures in the year 2100, everybody has to do it. It can't just be the U.S. And so you have to have an international tax agreement. What does that mean? You have to have an international tax cartel. Governments have to get together and agree on what this tax is going to be. And again, the incentive to squeeze revenues out of their respective public sectors, I think, are going to prove overwhelming. And it's far from clear to me how an international tax cartel, that's literally what we're talking about, would yield efficiency. All right, let me just briefly offer a footnote on international agreements. What about less developed countries, the third world? They're going to have to be subsidized. They can't afford it. I mean, the Indias of the world and the Sri Lankas of the world and the less developed nations in sub-Saharan Africa and all the rest simply cannot afford these policies. That's why, even in the context of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's this $100 billion fund that's supposed to be created to transfer wealth to those who can least afford these policies. That raises an interesting question. Why are these countries less developed? The answer is they have lousy institutions. They don't defend property rights very well. They don't have a rule of law that can be counted on. They don't have capitalism, as all of us would define that. And so the basic argument from the climate industry or from the carbon tax people or for those promoting international agreements on climate policy is that by raising energy costs in the third world and then putting them on welfare, we're going to produce more efficient outcomes. I don't think there's an adult, frankly, anywhere in the world who actually believes something like that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one dimension of the externality argument is the fat tail model, a small chance of a catastrophe. That argument is not silly, narrowly. It's really an argument for climate policy, not a carbon tax per se. The major problem with the fat tail argument is that there are two other fat tails. There's also the left hand. If you think about a statistical distribution of damage from increasing greenhouse gas concentrations with the mean centered on whatever number you believe to be the case, then there's a left tail too. And the left tail can be described as follows. With probability approaching 1, in other words, near certainty, someday there will be another ice age. We just don't know when. And so when that happens, anthropogenic warming may yield enormous benefits. And any benefit cost analysis that ignores that outcome has not been conducted correctly. And not surprisingly, the interagency working group in the Obama administration never considers this at all. Second, there is the issue of government policies and unintended consequences, or to put it a bit more crudely, the destructiveness of government policies. I would argue that not only, thank you very much, not only is that tail fat, that whole distribution lies way to the right. Think about what's going to happen in the third world when people in less developed countries are forced to cut their greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, 40%, 50%. The effect on living standards, life expectancies, and all the rest, or the adverse nature of those effects, are not to be dismissed lightly. Again, I think that's why visible regulations are more efficient than hidden taxes in the context of constraining government policy. There's the revenue neutrality argument. If we raise carbon taxes, we can cut the multiple taxation of capital and thus get an efficiency improvement. Well, that says nothing about a carbon tax. Why not a tax on zucchini? In any event, that can't possibly be a political equilibrium. The argument is we're going to raise everyone's energy costs, cut taxes on Mitt Romney, and that's going to get through Congress. Really? Please. Other taxes will have to be cut. And my guess is you'd have to have a cut in the payroll tax, which will transform even more Social Security and Medicare into social insurance programs, into welfare programs. I think the revenue neutrality argument is really rather myopic. Then there's the further matter. If you think about capital taxation in a world in which there's a need for national defense, both against foreign aggressors and against terrorists, then capital taxation turns out to be a user fee for national defense services. There can be too much investment in terms of increasing incentives of aggressors and terrorists to attack us. And so capital taxation is directly related to the demand for national defense services in a way that a carbon tax is unrelated to the demand for government services. And since I see no reason to believe a carbon tax is related to the demand for government services, it's not clear to me how it improves efficiency in the public sector. The revenues will be returned to the American people, which means the interest groups emerging as winners in the congressional bargaining process. The problem, of course, that it's not just the poor who are going to have to be compensated. There's a lower middle class, workers in energy-intensive sectors, sectors competing in international markets. It's very easy to come up with a solution, a political equilibrium in which 600% of the revenues will be spent. What that means is the private sector will be smaller and the public sector will be bigger. And I rather doubt that that's an outcome consistent with efficiency. A major shift in the tax system will obviously affect the size and the composition of the spending side of the budget. I haven't got time to get into that today. Think about benefit cost analysis. The current climate action plan from the Obama administration would, in the year 2100, reduce temperatures by 15 one-thousandths of a degree. If we throw in the supposed agreement with the Chinese announced last November, which is a bit of a joke, we get another 1/100th of a degree. If you assume the Chinese reduce their emissions 20% by 2030, you get 2/10ths of a degree, and the rest of the industrialized world 30% by 2030. You get another 2/10ths. The total effect of this will be about 4/10ths of a degree. How much should we be willing to spend for that? I think not very much. On political, the phrase carbon pollution, which you will hear endlessly, is political propaganda. Carbon dioxide is not carbon and it's not a pollutant. It is in certain minimum concentration of it is necessary for life. Water vapor is by far the most important greenhouse gas in terms of the radiative properties of the atmosphere. I don't hear anybody calling water vapor a pollutant. You know, I would urge you to use the phrase greenhouse gases. It has the virtue of scientific accuracy, without implicitly assuming the answer to the underlying policy question. Do not adopt the language of the environmental left, sustainability and all the rest. Economists are lousy politicians. The basic argument for a carbon tax is tautological. If we choose an efficient carbon tax and replace inefficient regulations with the efficient carbon tax, we'll get efficiency, which is a bit like arguing that the sun rises in the east. I think that the proponents of an efficient carbon tax have done a rather poor job of thinking through how such a tax would actually emerge in a world of political competition. So thanks very much.